Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Thursday, March 17th. And here's some of what we're talking about tonight. Ceasefire talks continue between Ukraine and Russia, but the toll on Ukrainian civilians continues to get worse. We'll have the latest on the bombing of a theater in the port city of Mariupol. Also tonight, we'll debate something that Ukraine has been demanding to help end this war.
I implemented a no-fly zone. I know how to do this. Can we do it? Sure. Should we? Not yet.
Why rule out the no-fly zone? Why not make Putin think it's possible?
We're not going to put the United States in direct conflict with Russia, not have, American planes flying against Russian planes.
A no-fly zone, good idea or bad idea? What does it take to create one, and how have they worked in the past? We'll give you the basics and debate this idea just ahead. Plus, who can break through Russian propaganda about this war? Perhaps Arnold Schwarzenegger. He dropped a video online in hopes of getting around Russian censors. What does this war look like on Russia's state-run news channels? Could videos like his get through? And the Census Bureau says it miscounted the U.S. population by millions of people, especially people of color. What happened? And can it be fixed? Russia's war on Ukraine is entering its fourth week, but the ground attack appears to have slowed down. The ground attack. From the air, the attacks are intensifying. Russia seems intent on destroying Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. Today, Ukrainian officials say 21 people were killed northeast of the city's center. Russian soldiers attacked the area with artillery shells. NBC News has not independently verified that claim from the government. Meanwhile, rescue crews began pulling survivors from a theater in the southern city of Mariupol. That theater was bombed yesterday. Hundreds of people had taken refuge there. Satellite images days before the attack appear to show big white letters outside the building. We circled them for you. They spell out the Russian word for children, apparently warning that kids were inside. More than 24 hours later, it is still unclear how many people survived. Today, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations painted a bleak picture of life in Ukraine today.
Local officials have told families to leave their dead relatives lying outside on the streets, exposed to the world, because it is simply too dangerous with the bombs and shellings to hold funerals.
Let's begin tonight with NBC's Cal Perry in Lviv. And Cal, based on what we just heard from Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, I can only imagine what it's been like where you are in Lviv, a little south of there, in Ivano-Frankivsk, where we have heard that there have been more Russian attacks.
Yeah, so look, I'm 350 miles from Kyiv, so we're not seeing that level, certainly, of violence. In fact, we're not seeing any violence from the war, but we are seeing the faces of the people who are fleeing the east. This is the major way station for the internally displaced people, and we're hearing stories like the one that you heard there from the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. These cities that are under siege, that are being bombed into rubble, and it seems to be spreading across the eastern part of the country. As you've sort of laid out, you know, the military advancement may have stalled geographically, but the intensity of attacks on civilian areas has picked up. Where I am here in Lviv, we've had an increase, I would say, in air raid sirens. We haven't heard explosions in the last 3 or 4 days. We did hear those airstrikes 4 days ago, but even those air raid sirens, it's enough to disrupt life in this city, and this is a city that used to have a population of 700,000, now over 1 million. It's enough to disrupt daily life, and it's enough to terrify the people who have fled these cities in the east coming here, thinking that it would be a respite from the violence, only to be running down into bunkers throughout the day.
President Zelensky, Ukraine's president, visited a hospital today in Kyiv that had wounded Ukrainians in it and spoke to a young girl there who was in the hospital. She was there because she had shielded her brother from Russian gunfire. Watch.
Всем непросто, мы все правильно делаем.
В ТикТоке все поддерживают.
Да? Тобто мы оккупировали ТикТок.
Все про вас, все про вас.
Yeah, she told President Zelensky that he's quite popular on TikTok among her friends. What's the latest in terms of the word from his office, the latest moves from Zelensky's office, and people's reactions to not only his actions in Ukraine, but his conversations with leaders around the world?
So, Joshua, there's an English saying, it's a cricket saying, cometh the hour, cometh the man. And that saying started making the rounds a few weeks ago when we started seeing videos of President Zelensky basically coordinating the war effort from Kyiv, refusing to leave the city, knowing that he was the top target for the Russians. And every day he puts out these videos. He puts them out in English, in Ukrainian. He speaks in Russian directly to Russian mothers about their sons. We heard an address tonight from him, in fact, to the mothers of Russian soldiers saying, your sons are dying here by the thousands. They need to be returned home. Do you know where they are? He talked about a hotline they can call. All of this is very well thought through. This is a strategy that he is using to rally support across the country. He is becoming a figure, not just a leader here in Ukraine, but as you're alluding to, he's becoming a world leader. We're under curfew, by the way, Joshua, and what seems to be happening is they sort of do resupply stuff. That's that noise behind me of trucks as they go around. He's become this leader in Europe as well, talking to foreign governments. And every day, people gravitate towards the television to see what it is that he's putting out. And again, he strikes this chord that Ukrainians know what they're fighting for, that they're fighting for their homes, they're fighting for their liberty, they're fighting for democracy. And it's the Russians who don't know what they're fighting for. And that message resonates very well here.
I should also ask you about the death of an American citizen that we heard about from the U.S. State Department. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke about that today. What more do we know?
So we know that in this city of Chernihiv, and this is north of Kyiv, there was this brutal attack yesterday on a bread line, on people waiting for food. And this is what I'm talking about when I say there's been increased attacks on the very lifelines that civilians rely on. And then today, it seems like that attack was followed up by a shelling of a residential area. It is in that shelling today that we understand that one American citizen was killed. We don't have details beyond that. Just to say, though, that it is emblematic of what we're seeing across the country. These civilian areas being at the very sort of least indiscriminately shelled and probably more realistically being directly targeted. And again, it's civilians as they're leaving these areas that are being targeted. It's civilians as they're waiting in these bread lines. It's civilians as they go for medical help that are being killed. And it seems as though an American was caught up in that.
Thank you, Cal. Please do stay safe. That's NBC's Cal Perry starting us off tonight from Lviv, Ukraine. Western allies are offering their support to Ukraine with humanitarian and military aid, as well as sanctions on Russia. But Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky wants them to do more. He brought one thing in particular up again yesterday in his speech to Congress.
This is a terror that Europe has not seen for 80 years, and we are asking for a reply, for an answer to this terror from the whole world. Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? Is this too much to ask?
Tonight, we're going to debate this idea, whether the West should set a no-fly zone over Ukraine. First, let's explain what that is. In a no-fly zone, a military power or alliance prevents an attack on another country by shutting down its airspace. In this instance, it would probably be the United States and NATO patrolling Ukraine's airspace. The idea is that they could shoot down any planes that enter the restricted area and refuse to leave. Now, the no-fly zone is a relatively new concept. It's only been used a handful of times.
Allied warplanes are enforcing the flight ban over Bosnia today. Fighters from the U.S., France, and the Netherlands are set to guard the UN-imposed no-fly zone. But Serb forces say this will not interfere with their military plans.
First, we are extending the no-fly zone in southern Iraq. This will deny Saddam control of Iraqi airspace from the Kuwaiti border to the southern suburbs of Baghdad.
On March 12th, the League of Arab States called on the Security Council to establish a no-fly zone and take other measures to protect civilians.
So as we showed you, the first one came about in the early 90s. The U.S. imposed it as part of the ceasefire agreement that ended the first Gulf War. The aggressor in this case was Saddam Hussein. Then in 1993, NATO imposed a no-fly zone in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the breakup of Yugoslavia. And then in 2011, a third no-fly zone was enforced over Libya during its civil war. The UN Security Council said its members could take, quote, all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians. Which brings us back to Ukraine. If the U.S. and NATO were to implement a no-fly zone, it would come with the distinct possibility of shooting down Russian planes. That almost certainly would escalate things, to say the least. This month, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that would be, in her words, the exact step that we want to avoid. Perhaps. But is there a better, faster way to bring this war to an end? Joining us to debate this idea are two guests with deep knowledge of the issue. John Herbst is a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He is one of the signatories of a letter urging the Biden administration and NATO to establish a no-fly zone. Ambassador Herbst, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Also with us is Dr. Robert Farley, a senior lecturer at the University of Kentucky's Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. He studies air power, and he is against the idea of a no-fly zone, limited or otherwise. Dr. Farley, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Since this is a debate, I should just lay out two very simple rules, neither of which I believe either of you will violate. One, no personal attacks. Two, no soliloquies. Please keep your answers as pointed and to the point as possible, because we have a lot of ground to cover. Starting, Ambassador, with you, since you are for the resolution, as it were, give me your one strongest argument in favor of a no-fly zone.
Well, again, I've advocated not a straight no-fly zone, but a humanitarian air corridor with air cover. And right now, Russian air power is murdering civilians intentionally, preventing civilians from leaving areas which they are pounding, and preventing supplies from getting in. People in Mariupol are dying of now not just bombs, but also the absence of food, the absence of medical supplies. So I follow up an idea developed by General Phil Breedlove and Ambassador Kurt Volker for a humanitarian no-fly zone or a humanitarian corridor supported by air power, which would enable convoys to go in and enable civilians to come out. And this is just a follow-up on something we did in Georgia when Moscow invaded Georgia in 2008, and we sent in humanitarian supplies by both plane and by ship.
Right. Dr. Farley, what is your one strongest argument against a no-fly zone?
Well, I mean, I'll be straightforward. I think that the humanitarian corridor or no-fly zone is completely unworkable from a technical and operational standpoint. If American aircraft are flying through a humanitarian corridor or attempting to defend a humanitarian corridor, they will be targeted and painted by Russian surface-to-air missile systems, both in Russia and in Ukraine. This will require them to engage those systems and to fire anti-radiation missiles, which will mean killing Russians immediately. The Russians also have air-to-air missiles, so their aircraft can launch missiles from Russia that can reach NATO aircraft in the no-fly zone. The Russians also have surface-to-air missile systems that they can base in Russia that will be able to control the no-fly zone. So it'll immediately put U.S. and NATO aircraft in danger without actually preventing any of the attacks that the ambassador is suggesting would be prevented.
Ambassador, what about that? I hear what Dr. Farley is saying in terms of the potential, the dramatically higher potential for there to be contact between Western countries and Russia, even if that corridor is intended to be humanitarian.
The only problem with his answer, he ignored what I said at the end of my first statement, which is we did something similar, not exactly the same like this in Georgia, without incident. Moscow already has its hands full dealing with Ukrainian forces. It does really not want to deal with NATO forces as well, which are far stronger than Russia's conventional military. So what I'm suggesting would put the onus on Moscow to essentially launch an attack on our aircraft. The professor's right that our planes would be at risk. They could, quote unquote, be painted. But it's also true that the greater risk lies with the Kremlin. And we've done something similar before.
With regard to what we're dealing with now, Ambassador Herbst, do you think that the thought process in Russia now is the same as it was in Georgia then? I mean, a lot of people have kind of questioned whether Vladimir Putin is playing by any kind of a rule book that would lead him to make logical, tactical decisions. If he made logical, tactical decisions, some would argue, we wouldn't be having any of these conversations right now.
I can't rule out what you've said, but what I can tell you for sure is that Putin has threatened escalation, including nuclear escalation, over a variety of issues. And we have been intimidated by that. That's why the administration made the very bad decision not to send those MiGs from Poland to Ukraine. If Putin realizes by threatening
he can get us to stop defending our interests. What's to stop him from moving on the Baltic states, which happen to be NATO allies? So we need to understand that we're a superpower too, and we in fact are more powerful in all ways than Russia, with the exception of nuclear power, where we are equals. And we were able to manage a much more difficult danger coming from the Soviet Union when we had to defend our interests in Berlin in '61 and in Cuba in '62.
Dr. Farley, with regard to the impact of this, there seems to be some growing public support for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. There was a Reuters poll from a few weeks ago that put public support at 74%. A CBS News poll put it at 59%. I've seen Quinnipiac polls that show even higher support if this should happen to involve NATO allies in terms of putting boots on the ground. I think one of the arguments that the Ukrainians have made, and I'm paraphrasing, trying to simplify, but that the West is kind of afraid to get its nose bloody in a war where we are superior military power and children are being killed in buildings that have the word children written in big white letters to try to save their lives. If not this, then what else?
So that sounds to me like we must do something, and this is something, so we ought to do it. The fact is that most of the outrages being committed by the Russian military right now are being done by artillery. Russia has enough artillery to incinerate every city in Ukraine. It can incinerate Kharkiv, it can incinerate Kiev, and every other city. It doesn't need air power. Most of the Russian air power that is actually engaged in attacks in Ukraine so far would not at all be covered by a no-fly zone, because Russian aircraft are firing from the Russian side of the border standoff munitions that are landing in Ukraine. And so to have a no-fly zone, the United States Air Force would need to engage Russian aircraft flying in Russian airspace before they fired their very long-range missiles, which can strike all over Ukraine. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough that this makes no sense. And to talk about the polling, there was a wonderful poll, and it escapes my mind just now, but once it was explained to the people who were being polled what a no-fly zone meant, that it meant direct engagement against Russian aircraft, support for the no-fly zone fell from the 60s into the 30s. And that's the problem here, right? People don't know what this term means. It sounds like something that ought to be done, but in fact, it's incredibly dangerous.
Ambassador, what about that? I think the idea that a lot of people have in mind is that if you have this no-fly zone, like if this space, this box I'm in right now, is a no-fly zone, that you're trying to stop weapons being dropped like this instead of weapons being fired like this from outside in. And the prospect of Western and NATO planes having to fly into Russian airspace where these attacks are originating, does that change your thought process at all on whether this is feasible?
You know, Phil Breedlove was a 4-star Air Force general, and it was his idea. So he understands the military repercussions of this very well. The whole idea is to protect a convoy, which our planes would be, or our NATO planes would be over. And the Russians would understand they leave that convoy alone. Whether that convoy is going in with medical supplies and food, or whether it's coming out with civilians from an area which is being struck by artillery from where it's being fired. And so the Russians would understand if they attacked that convoy, our planes would respond. I suspect in that case, they probably would leave the convoy alone. And the whole idea is to save lives. The one thing we know for sure is if we don't take steps like this, more civilians will die in large numbers. And again, we sent humanitarian shipments into Georgia when Russia was conducting a war against Georgia, and there were no incidents. We sent a Navy ship with humanitarian supplies into Georgian ports during that same war without repercussion.
I just want to be clear, Ambassador, because I hear what you're describing, and I don't want people to conflate what you're describing with what I think President Zelensky is describing. He sounds like he's describing something that is much more far-reaching than a specific kind of a contoured no-fly zone that goes right over a humanitarian convoy, protects it, and then presumably disbands once that convoy has made it safely in. I don't think that would be enough for President Zelensky. I don't think that's what he asked for. Do you think that there is a viable case for what the Ukrainians are actually asking for?
That's a very good question. And you would have to ask President Zelensky if that's what he has in mind. But what I can tell you is this, and this I know with precision. He initially called for a no-holds-barred, no-fly zone, the type the professor described, the type that I do not support, because that would require us to take preemptive strikes at Russian military installations. But during his speech to our Congress, apparently he'd been watching the debate in the United States, because he's a smart man, and he called for a humanitarian no-fly zone. How precisely that jibes with what I've described, again, we have to talk to him.
I am hearing a bit of overlap from the two of you. It sounds like neither of you is in support of a kind of a broader no-fly zone over all of Ukraine. Ambassador, I hear you saying you support a much more targeted no-fly zone to protect humanitarian aid. Dr. Farley, with regards to other alternatives, though, the Biden administration announced this week $800 million more support on top of what's already been pledged. That brings it up to $1 billion. You can see an array of different kinds of arms and munitions, body armor, Javelin anti-armor systems, which have been described as one of the more useful munitions we could send because they would help take out tanks, which have been a significant part of the Russian onslaught so far. If not a no-fly zone, is something like this the next best thing, Doctor, or would you concede that there are some things that only an actual no-fly zone can do?
I mean, the only thing a no-fly zone can do right now is get us much closer to a very significant escalation, especially given the Russian artillery dominance. I absolutely support giving more aid to Ukraine right now. We are working on transferring long-range surface-to-air missile systems like the S-300, other systems that NATO countries have and could possibly pass over to the Ukrainians that could substantially improve their control over their own airspace. The British are sending surface-to-air missiles. I think that the MiG deal in the long term is possibly workable and is something we should be looking at rather than sort of junking it right now. But the idea that we're going to fly American fighters to the outskirts of Kharkiv and the Russians aren't going to do anything about it, I mean, I think it's not only dangerous, it's also absurd.
Ambassador, you were in support of the idea, so I'm going to give you the last word since your side has the burden of proof before we go.
Well, I think we've delineated the differences. We both agree against a large no-fly zone. We both think we should provide much more military support to Ukraine. And we disagree regarding the humanitarian corridor no-fly zone. But as I said, this is not a crazy idea. We've done a good bit of it before without mishap.
I should note, by the way, that Estonia has become the first NATO member to actually call for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Its parliament passed a measure yesterday demanding that. Ambassador John Herbst, Dr. Robert Farley, this has been extremely helpful, at least to me, in thinking through what this idea of a no-fly zone might be. Gentlemen, we appreciate you both making time tonight. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Now, no-fly zones are just one of the big questions that many people have about the war in Ukraine. And hopefully we just made that a lot clearer for you. But we'd like to answer more of those questions. Anything at all that you want to know, anything you've been arguing with your friends about or wondering to yourself, that question you're afraid to ask because it might seem basic, because it might seem controversial, send it my way. Tell us at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, or Instagram. You can reach out to us directly by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. What questions do you have about this war? You can also email us now tonight at NBCnews.com. Covering Ukraine is incredibly tough right now, but reporting on Russia has gotten dangerous too. What is the media landscape in Moscow today? And what was it before this war? We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Today, Arnold Schwarzenegger posted a video on Telegram with a plea to Russian soldiers and citizens. Telegram is one of the few apps that's still allowed in Russia. The Austrian-born celebrity was very candid about his family's past with the Nazis and the harm that caused. His father fought with the Nazi army during World War II. He was injured in Leningrad.
My father arrived in Leningrad. He was all pumped up on the lies of his government. And when he left Leningrad, he was broken, physically and mentally. He lived the rest of his life in pain. Pain from a broken back, pain from the shrapnel that always reminded him of these terrible years, and pain from the guilt that he felt. So I urge the Russian people and the Russian soldiers in Ukraine to understand the propaganda and the disinformation that you're being told. I ask you to help me spread the truth. Let your fellow Russians know the human catastrophe that is happening in Ukraine.
We asked you online what you think it will take to get the truth to the Russian people, whether videos like this will work. Jess in Wisconsin tweeted, much more outreach like this, blasting television signals into Russia at maximum wattage to reach as many people as possible, forcing them to see the reality on the ground. Glenn ISL tweeted, my fear is that they can't receive transmission of the video. It's powerful, beautiful, incredible, but only if they have a chance to see and hear Arnold's words. Let's discuss it with Fred Kaplan. He's the War Stories columnist for Slate magazine and also the author of The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. Mr. Kaplan, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
What do you make of videos like what Arnold Schwarzenegger released? I watched it this morning. It's like just over 9 minutes long. It was rather heartfelt. He was very candid about like how he had a deep affinity for the Russian people, how he could kind of relate to what happened to his father in, as he views it, a kind of parallel propagandistic war situation. Is it possible that that might have some kind of impact?
A little bit. You have to sort of go out of your way to want to hear something like that to begin with and dial into certain things on the internet. It's becoming, as I understand it, increasingly difficult. There is an independent news agency called Medusa, which had to get out of Russia altogether. They're operating from Lithuania. They can't receive money from Russia because all the credit cards are frozen. They're asking for money from Western people. So it can be done, but I mean, it's almost like communicating. Let's say you live in a totalitarian society. It's like communicating with somebody through shortwave radio, you know, through CBs or something like that. It's not a big deal, but reaching the right person, you never know what might happen.
Yeah. Paint us a picture of what is happening now in terms of kind of impeding messages from the outside. I think we've kind of heard it in bits and pieces as it's sort of materialized over time, but like, what are some of the barriers to getting the reality in Ukraine if you are an average, everyday Russian citizen in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Vladivostok or wherever? Like, what's in the way right now?
Everything. You know, you can now, according to a new Russian law, you can go to jail for 15 years for saying in a newspaper article or on the TV or on the radio that Russia is fighting a war now, using the word war instead of special military operation. So given that, basically all the media are state-controlled, and whereas there used to be some leeway for letting certain stations or people say certain independent things, all that is completely gone. There used to be a radio station called Echo of Moscow, which was genuinely independent. It shut down. There was a small TV station called Dozhd, meaning rain. It's now completely shut down. So there is, if you're just looking at what is readily available, there is nothing other than state propaganda.
Take us back a little bit farther. I know you worked in Moscow during basically Boris Yeltsin's days, like mid-90s. What was it like? And I know that's another era, granted, but what was it like for you even then covering Russia in this kind of transitional period? Did you have minders? Were there censors? Like, what did you deal with in terms of just reporting from there?
No. I mean, this was also a rather unusual time in Russian history. I'm sure that my phone was tapped. I know that my apartment was bugged. I don't know if anybody was even listening to me. The KGB was pretty much destructed. But the media were genuinely free. There were a number of TV stations, newspapers, magazines, radio that was as free and independent as anything in the United States. There was a political satire program on television that at the time was more savage and devastating than anything on American television. I got to know a number of reporters who were as dedicated and energetic and hardworking and hard digging and independent in their commentary as any newspaper reporters you would find in any Western country. Now, this lasted a few years. And then came Putin, and it gradually disappeared.
Yeah, I was to contrast that with what you just described with what we heard from NBC's Raf Sanchez. He was in Moscow, has since kind of rotated out, and tweeted some of his observations in terms of what he's noticed there now, some examples of what he's seen on Russian television. In this example, the Kremlin highlighted wounded Russian soldiers being awarded medals in the hospital, did not mention how many soldiers were wounded, but just showed them being apparently, supposedly, awarded medals. There have been claims of neo-Nazism. One clip claimed to show a Nazi flag that was supposedly captured on a Ukrainian base. And a number of clips of American conservatives have been making the rounds, particularly clips of Tucker Carlson from Fox News and Republican Congressman Madison Cawthorn that have been used as part of the propaganda and repeated quite a bit. I know I got to let you go in just a second, but what do you make of this? It sounds like the idea is to create absolute certainty on the Russian government's line and create massive doubt on everything else, including the American people's agreement that this war is an atrocity.
Yeah, and no alternative facts, to coin a phrase. They are the facts that the Russian government wants you to hear and read, and none others. So imagine in the United States, you had Tucker Carlson and people like him, and absolutely nothing else. That's all there is. That's you know, just do your own extrapolation. That's what it is. And to make it criminal to offer any alternative renditions of what's going on.
Fred Kaplan, war stories columnist for Slate magazine. His book is called The Bomb: Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. Mr. Kaplan, thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
Meanwhile, people in Kyiv have managed to keep Russian forces on the outskirts of town, at least so far. But pressure is building around the capital, and Russian airstrikes are destroying more homes. From our partners at Sky News, Alex Crawford has the latest from Kyiv.
The terror caused by these attacks cannot be overstated. Their life's work and all their possessions blown away in an instant. By chance, the family weren't here, and they're still very much in shock.
I'm so sorry. This is the kitchen that is utterly destroyed.
The Russian troops have stopped short of entering Kiev, but they're wreaking horror inside the homes of its residents from afar.
My goodness, complete devastation here.
The windows just blew in, he says. Any stalling of the Russian offensive means nothing to those at the end of their missiles. I don't even know how to describe this, Mikhailo says. I don't have the words. He pauses. He can't quite find strong enough phrases for what his family's going through right now. There is no humanity here. This is not war with some army, he says. This is war with humans, just eliminating other humans. This is an atrocity for which no judge would ever find any justification. It's madness, he says. And few right now would disagree with him. On the other side of the street, his neighbours took the full brunt of the blast. The front garden's now a 15-foot deep crater.
This has landed right in the middle of a very, very suburban area. All around here are residential homes, many of which were still occupied, and this is exactly what the International Criminal Court is investigating, a potential war crime.
We're shown the remnants of the missile. They're desperate here to ensure those who attacked them are held accountable. The blast has made this home's front entrance impassable. So we're taken in through one of the damaged windows. The Russian soldiers seem to have been held back from encircling the main city. But they're now resorting to long-range attacks which are indiscriminate and terrifying.
This is just utterly a whole family house just reduced to ruins and rubble. Every room is like this with holes blasted through it. How safe do you feel living here now?
Of course I don't feel safe here, he says. Where is safe now? There's shooting, bombing, rockets hitting us. We live here, but we know it's very dangerous here. Few feel safe in a capital where random strikes can happen anywhere, anytime. Ukrainian defenses have somehow held off the Russian forces from their main city, but they can't stop the horror unfolding here. This is the raw pain of knowing someone you love has gone and your life will never be the same. It's heartbreak being replayed all over Ukraine. This bombardment may be a desperate attempt to break the capital's spirit. Russian troops look like they're struggling to complete their strangulation of the capital anytime soon. But for both sides, Kiev is everything, and that might mean more erratic and wretched war actions ahead. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Kiev.
We will get to some of today's other headlines after the break, including about the 2020 census. The government says it miscounted the U.S. population, particularly along racial lines. Plus, NASA is rolling its new mega rocket to the launch pad. It's the first step in going back to the moon. And on this St. Patrick's Day, we will take you inside a historic Irish ale house here in New York. It's got a simple house rule: be good or be gone. How accurately did the 2020 census count the U.S. population? According to a new report from the Census Bureau, far from perfectly. Some people may have been counted twice, others not at all, and race is a factor. The Census Bureau says the 2020 survey may have missed a lot of Black, Latino, and Native American people, especially on tribal reservations. Conversely, it may have overcounted whites. That can affect the nation in many ways, especially congressional apportionment. Right now, a number of states are fighting over their new maps of congressional districts. Census data shape those maps. Those data also determine where federal money goes, including for infrastructure like roads and hospitals. And the census helps us respond to emergencies in disaster areas. How did these miscounts happen? And is there any way to fix them? Joining us now is Hansi Lo Wong. He covers the census as a national correspondent for NPR News. Hansi, let's start with some of the data around the undercounts, both in the 2010 census and in the 2020 census. As you can see from the numbers, we'll put the chart up. Some of the undercounts have gone up from past years. There's never a perfect count, but what's our best sense of the impact of this undercount? What does this mean?
This means that there is a growing racial gap in these numbers that are really used to reset democracy once every 10 years. The 2020 census, the best way to sum it up in 2 words is it was a hot mess. It faced COVID-19 just as counting was getting started nationwide, and it faced interference from former President Donald Trump's administration over years. And all of those factors are really baked into these numbers that now the Census Bureau's accuracy report, its first major accuracy report, shows that certain groups were counted differently, that there were accuracy levels that really along racial and ethnic lines. For Latinos, the net undercount rate more than tripled in 2020 compared to 2010. And for people who identify as white and not Latino, that net overcount rate almost doubled compared to 10 years ago. And so these are all signs of the Census Bureau is still facing this massive challenge of trying to get an accurate count of every person living in the country.
What is the Census Bureau's sense of why this happened? You mentioned a number of factors: COVID, interference from the Trump administration. Some statisticians have also said that Black and Latino households, for any number of surveys, can be more difficult to survey for an array of different reasons. What does the Census Bureau think happened here?
Well, this is part of the Census Bureau's research to get ready for 2030, the 2030 census. That planning is already getting started, and this is going to be a major question they're going to try to pick apart and figure out. But generally speaking, the Census Bureau, just as any survey taker in the United States of America, is facing, in the general public, fewer and fewer people want to participate in surveys, especially surveys that are conducted by the federal government. And even though there are federal laws that protect a person's personally identifiable information from being released, some people didn't trust that the Trump administration at that time would have necessarily upheld those laws and are distrustful of the federal government. So that's a major challenge the Census Bureau has faced decade after decade, and increasingly so in recent years. And in addition to that, there are just bigger questions right now about, is it something about the way the U.S. conducts a census that really fundamentally needs to be revisited, rethought, reimagined? Because this racial gap in the numbers, this is not a new thing. This is not something just because from 2010 and 2020, if you look at 2000, you look at 1990, you go back decade after decade since the Census Bureau started trying to measure the accuracy of these numbers along racial and ethnic lines, there has been a racial gap. It tends to be that people identify as white and not Latino are overcounted, while generally speaking, people of color are undercounted. And now census advocates, civil rights organizations are asking, how long should this pattern, this trend be allowed to be sustained if there is something fundamental about how the Census Bureau conducts a census every 10 years?
So what happens now? I mean, this 2020 census is over. I don't know. Well, let me ask you, is there more to be done with the numbers from 2020? If they know that there are these errors, can they fix them and account for them in this year's numbers? And then what happens from here? Are they going to ask for more money from Congress? Do they just need to improve their methods? Talk to us about what the next steps are.
One major focus is the Census Bureau puts out every year population estimates. And what drives those estimates are the results of the 2020 census. And so a lot of civil rights organizations are asking and pushing the Census Bureau, can the Bureau factor in these over and undercount rates into how it produces these population estimates? And these population estimates are a large part, they make up the bulk of the data that drives the funding that goes out to local communities, an estimated $1.5 trillion a year for healthcare, for education, for transportation, other public services, driven by how these population estimates are produced. There's a push to see if the Census Bureau can try to factor those in. The Census Bureau says it needs to do more research, and that could take some time. So that's one front I'm looking at. And beyond that, the Census Bureau is, like I said, getting ready to plan for the 2030 census, trying to do some takeaways, some lessons learned from 2020. Part of that's going to involve more research of what are other ways of conducting this census, possibly increasing the use of existing government records to try to fill in the gaps and maybe get people counted that otherwise wouldn't get counted. That's going to take time. Right. That's also going to take money, and the Census Bureau is going to see how much funding you can get over the next few years.
Let me plant a seed for those of you watching for 2030. Please fill out the census. Please. NPR's Hansi-Lo Wong, we appreciate you making time. Good to see you. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
It's been more than 50 years since Neil Armstrong said what the whole world was thinking.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Today, NASA took a big step toward making that giant leap again. The Artemis 1 rolled out of the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. A lot of us were so geeked about this video. That vehicle that it's on is called a crawler transporter, and it is making its way oh so slowly to Launch Pad 39A. Top speed of the crawler, less than 1 mile per hour. NASA's Artemis program will take humans back to the moon. The first part, Artemis 1, is an uncrewed mission just to test the spacecraft. That could launch in May. NASA plans to have humans aboard Artemis 3 sometime in 2025. Back here on Earth, it's St. Patrick's Day. President Biden met virtually with Ireland's Prime Minister. It's Taoiseach Micheál Martin. Many cities across the U.S. celebrated publicly for the first time since the pandemic began. Chicago River was colored green for the occasion, as usual. And New York's Fifth Avenue hosted the largest and oldest St. Patrick's Day parade on Earth. The city has held this event since 1762. New York's Irish pubs will be hopping tonight, especially one in the East Village. It is reportedly the oldest bar in the city, founded before the Civil War. Here's NBC's Harry Smith.
An Irish storyteller is called a Seanachie. And we know one who claims McSorley's Old Ale House is the longest continuously operating bar in New York City since 1854, if you can believe it. Ever since then, the bar has been a place to shed your woes, meet your friends, and share a cup or two.
What's a best night like here? When this place is at its best, what is it like to be inside this room?
I hate this sounds really corny. It's a kind of heaven. It's like you're surrounded by throngs of really wonderful human mirth.
Bart Bartholomew knows. He spent just a few rounds shy of 50 years behind the bar here, where he says most patrons heed the establishment credo: be good or be gone.
There's something about it. You're in the middle of a hive, I guess, of human warmth and good cheer and everything, and that's great.
Many a Saturday morning, Bart would bring his little boy to McSorley's. So entranced by the goings-on was Rafe Bartholomew, he vowed one day he'd work here too. And then he wrote a book about it.
What makes this place different from other old bars in town?
For me, it's that the place still runs as much as possible like it did when John McSorley opened it in 1854. The way they serve the ale, the sawdust on the floors, the chairs, the tables, the bar itself.
The stuff on the walls, milestones, memories, history, some enough to give you pause.
So what is this up here?
These are our World War I wishbones. We consider that the most precious artifacts in the bar. You know, in 1917, a group of, regular guys, mostly locals from the neighborhood, were shipping out to World War I, and they had a going-away party here. At the end of the night, they each hung a wishbone on the gas lamp for good luck, in hopes that they would come back. After the war, those who survived came back and took down a wishbone. And those who never made it, their wishbones have been there ever since.
McSorley's devotion to the past is steadfast. As was true when the bar first opened, your choice of drink is ale, light or dark. Imagine an Irish bar that serves no whiskey.
Light or dark?
No Jamesons, no.
No Bushmills?
No Bushmills, no.
No Tullamore Dew?
No, you're getting into good stuff now.
There is an enduring and endearing stubbornness here. When Matthew Marr became the bar's third owner in the 1970s, he pledged to keep it the same. His daughter Teresa runs it now and continues the commitment to forswear, fad, or fashion.
How proud are you of this place?
Oh, I'm very proud. I'm beyond words. It's more than a bar. It's like history. It's my family. It's life. I think this place, teaches all of us something, especially that work here.
Like Bart, who quite honestly spent most of his life here.
You always want to have some kind of meaning or significance to your life, and it's here for me. After loving my wife and my son and being a good father and good husband, this place is it's the meaning of my life.
John McSorley escaped the potato famine and built something of permanence in New York's bowels. Hard not to imagine his Irish eyes still smiling.
That was NBC's Harry Smith reporting. The controversy over a transgender college athlete may have just escalated tonight. Leah Thomas has been getting support and criticism for competing in women's swimming. A look at what trans athletes are facing, and we'll tell you how Ms. Thomas did today. Before we go. The controversy over transgender athletes may have escalated tonight after a Division I swim meet. Today, Leah Thomas, a senior at Penn, competed in the 500-yard freestyle, and she won. Ms. Thomas is the first out trans athlete to win a D1 NCAA championship. She fulfilled all the rules for transgender students to compete. Still, she faced some opposition at the race. Outside the arena, some protesters chanted, "Save women's sports." Meanwhile, more states are following through with bans on these athletes. One young athlete in Iowa is speaking out against that state's new law.
I've never really thought of sports as for me, like a competitive way.
Like many kids in high school, freshman Gavi Smith loves to play sports. For her, it's about camaraderie.
It was something that like all the girls did pretty much, and I was just like, oh, I want to be like that and just join the team and just have fun and stuff.
Smith has competed in volleyball, softball, track, and was gearing up to take a swing at golf. But Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds signed House File 2416. It bans transgender girls from playing women's sports from kindergarten through college.
It just made me sad that people would feel that way and want this to happen. I tried to hide it because I was at school and I just needed that strong, aspect of me, so.
Gavi says she always identified as a girl. In 4th grade, she made it official.
I just remember that was the big step, changing my name wise, in school. And I just remember the teacher being like, is this the name that you want on your desk? And I was just like, yes, that's perfect.
Tiffany Smith says she remembers when her daughter's identity sank in.
I think it was in 3rd grade is when Gavi wore the dress to school without my knowledge and then came home with it on, which at that point I kind of had an aha moment, okay, this isn't going away, it's not a phase.
But now Gavi's life enters a new phase, with Iowa's new law affecting her athletics.
Just doing these sports, like volleyball, it was the first ever girls sport that I have ever done. It really helped me through my transition with the people that I played with and just being part of a team.
This latest ban comes after almost a dozen similar laws in Republican-controlled states. Governor Reynolds calls it a fairness issue. She claims that trans athletes have an unfair advantage in women's sports.
I'd like to reiterate the principle of this bill. Women deserve the same opportunity as men to develop their talents and strive for excellence. The principle of equality, equal opportunity justifies virtually all the progress women have made over the centuries.
I think what we've really seen is a race to the bottom among these state legislators. They are in a competition to see who has the least tolerance for the existence of trans students.
Jillian Brandstetter works with the National Women's Law Center. She argues that these new state laws violate federal laws, including the non-discrimination policy known as Title IX.
It can be a bit confusing because we know that trans kids under Title IX do have a right to equal access to facilities at schools, a right to safe schools, and certainly a right to fair participation in athletics. We will continue to see these laws challenged in court.
These laws can take a mental toll on trans youth. Last year, a national survey by the Trevor Project found 42% of LGBTQ youth said they seriously considered suicide. That includes more than half of transgender and non-binary youth.
They are already not doing well. They already face really high and really grave risks for violence, for mental health distress, for suicide, everything from lower grades and dropping out of school to future chances of homelessness and living in poverty.
Gavi Smith says sports helped her cope with the realities of being transgender, giving her a place to belong.
Gavi being able to play sports has really brought her mental health around in a positive aspect. Her grandma always tells her when she's out playing sports, you have such a pretty smile, keep smiling when you're out there because it looks like you're having so much fun.
I just want everyone to know that we're not here to steal your titles, your scholarships, your trophies. All we want is just to be included.
Thank you for making time for us. Remember to send us your questions on the war in Ukraine by voicemail, email, or on social media at NBC Now Tonight. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.